the vast and unforgiving Atlantic Ocean crashes with relentless fury against the jagged black rocks of the Outer Hebrides in Scotland. This is a place where civilization ends and the primal forces of nature reign supreme over the dark and churning waters. Situated roughly 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis lie the Flannan Isles, which are a small cluster of 7 uninhabited rocky islands known to the locals as the Seven Hunters. They rise from the sea like jagged teeth and have long been associated with dark folklore and superstitious dread by the fishermen who trawl these dangerous waters. In the year 1900, a tragedy unfolded here that would baffle investigators and haunt the minds of maritime historians for over a century. It was a mystery that combined the raw power of the elements with the chilling possibility of something far more sinister and unexplainable. On the 26th day of December in the year 1900, a lighthouse tender ship named the Hesperus sliced through the cold gray waves toward the largest of the islands known as Eilean Mor. The ship was captained by James Harvey, who was a seasoned mariner familiar with the treacherous moods of the Hebridean seas. The Hesperus was on a routine mission to relieve the lighthouse keepers stationed on the island and to bring supplies and Christmas cheer to the isolated men. Among the passengers was Joseph Moore, who was the relief keeper anxious to begin his shift and reunite with his colleagues. As the silhouette of Eilean Mor emerged from the mist, a sense of unease began to settle over the crew. The lighthouse, which should have been standing tall as a beacon of safety, appeared strangely lifeless against the gloomy winter sky. As the Hesperus drew closer to the rugged coastline, Captain James Harvey noted with growing concern that there was no flag flying from the lighthouse flagstaff. This was the first sign that something was terribly wrong on the island. Typically, the keepers would have spotted the approaching relief vessel hours in advance and raised the flag to welcome their comrades. Furthermore, none of the usual preparations for landing had been made. There were no protective boxes rigged to hoist supplies ashore, and no keepers were visible on the landing platform or the steep stairs carved into the rock. Captain James Harvey ordered the ship whistle to be blown shrilly, hoping to rouse the men from the tower. The sound echoed mournfully off the cliffs, but the only response was the desolate cry of seabirds circling overhead in the gray mist. A heavy silence hung over the deck of the Hesperus as the crew exchanged worried glances. Joseph Moore felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach as he stared up at the silent lighthouse. He knew the 3 men stationed there were reliable and experienced veterans of the lighthouse service. James Duckett was the principal keeper, with over 20 years of experience, and a family waiting for him on the mainland. Thomas Marshall was the second assistant keeper, and was known for his steady nerves and physical strength. Donald MacArthur was the occasional keeper, who had been brought in to replace a sick colleague. It was inconceivable that all three men would neglect their duties simultaneously, unless a catastrophe of immense proportions had befallen them on this lonely rock. With the sea swelling around the base of the cliffs, Captain James Harvey ordered a boat to be lowered. Joseph Mor boarded the small craft along with 2 crewmen, and they navigated the treacherous surge to the east landing. The ocean heaved and smashed against the stone steps, making the ascent dangerous and difficult. When Joseph Mor finally leaped onto the wet concrete of the landing jetty, he was struck by the oppressive silence that enveloped the island. There was no shout of greeting, and no sound of heavy boots clattering down the stairs. The only noise was the ceaseless roar of the wind and the waves. Joseph Mor began the long climb up the steep, winding steps toward the lighthouse compound, his heart pounding. With a mixture of exertion and escalating fear, the ascent to the lighthouse was a grueling trek up 160 feet of steep cliffside. As Joseph Mor climbed higher, he scanned the horizon and the plateau for any sign of James Ducat or Thomas Marshall or Donald MacArthur. The island of Eilean Mor was not large, and there were few places a man could hide. The grass was short and wind-blown, and the rocky outcrops offered little shelter. When he reached the summit, he approached the entrance gate to the lighthouse compound. To his surprise, he found the gate closed but unlocked. This was unusual, but not inexplicable. Yet it added to the growing sense of wrongness. He walked through the courtyard, calling out the names of his friends, but his voice was snatched away by the wind. Joseph Mor approached the heavy entrance door of the lighthouse tower. It too was closed, but unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped into the cool, dim interior of the entrance hall. The air inside was stale and cold, suggesting that no fire had been lit for some time. He called out again, shouting for James Ducat and Thomas Marshall. But the stone walls only threw his own voice back at him. He hurried up the spiral staircase to the living quarters, hoping to find the men asleep or perhaps ill in their bunks. When he entered the kitchen area, he stopped dead in his tracks. The fire in the grate was dead, and the ashes were cold, indicating it had burned out days ago. The silence in the room was heavier than the stone blocks of the tower itself. The scene in the kitchen was frozen in time. A meal appeared to have been prepared, but left uneaten. There was meat and potatoes on the table, and pickles in a jar. However contrary to popular myths that would later circulate, the chairs were not overturned in a struggle. The room was tidy, and everything was in its proper place, except for the men who lived there. Joseph Mor noticed that the clock on the mantelpiece had stopped. Its hands were frozen, presumably at the moment it had wound down after being neglected. The stillness of the clock was a potent symbol of the life that had vanished from the tower. Joseph Mor checked the bedrooms, but the bunks were empty, and neatly made. There was no sign of violence inside the lighthouse. Terrified and bewildered, Joseph Mor raced back down the stairs and out of the lighthouse. He searched the immediate vicinity of the compound, checking the storerooms and the outbuildings. He found nothing. He returned to the landing where the boat was waiting and reported the grim news to the crewmen. They rowed back to the Hesperus, and Joseph Mor informed Captain James Harvey that the keepers had vanished. The captain immediately organized a search party. The second mate and a seaman joined Joseph Mor, and they returned to the island to conduct a more thorough investigation. They agreed that they would scour every inch of Eilean Mor until they found the missing men or discovered what fate had befallen them. The search party moved methodically across the island, battling the strong winds that buffeted the cliffs. They checked the gullies and the crevices where a man might have fallen or sought shelter. They peered over the precipitous edges of the cliffs into the boiling sea below. As they searched, they began to notice strange anomalies that hinted at the violence of the weather in the preceding days. At the west landing, which was on the opposite side of the island from where they had arrived, the damage was catastrophic. Iron railings that had been cemented into the rock were twisted and bent like wire. A massive block of stone weighing over a ton had been dislodged from its position high above the sea level and thrown onto the rocks below. This evidence of extreme weather at the west landing was puzzling, because the lighthouse logbook entries would later reveal that the weather had been calm during the days leading up to the disappearance. The destruction suggested a storm of unprecedented ferocity, yet the tower itself stood undamaged. The search party returned to the lighthouse to examine the logbook, hoping it would provide a clue to the final hours of the keepers. The last entry in the logbook was dated December 15, 1900. This meant that whatever had happened took place 11 days before the arrival of the Hesperus. The entries leading up to that final date painted a disturbing and confusing picture of the mental state of the men. The logbook entries were written by James Duckett, the principal keeper, on December 12. He wrote that severe winds were battering the island, the likes of which he had never seen in 20 years. This was strange because nearby ships and weather stations had reported no significant storms on that date. Even more unsettling was the note that Thomas Marshall, the second assistant, was crying. Thomas Marshall was a seasoned sailor and a man of great fortitude. The idea of him weeping in fear of a storm seemed completely out of character. The entry went on to say that the third man, Donald MacArthur, was also crying. For two experienced men to be reduced to tears by the weather was deeply alarming to Joseph Mor as he read the words. The entries continued on December 13. James Duckett wrote that the storm was still raging and that the men were praying. the image of 3 hardened lighthouse keepers huddled in the tower, praying for deliverance from a storm that no one else saw, is a chilling one. Lighthouse keepers were not known to be particularly religious men in the face of bad weather. They trusted in the stone and engineering of the lighthouse. For them to resort to desperate prayer suggested they were facing something that defied their understanding and their courage. The isolation of Eilean Mor seemed to have amplified their fear, turning the wind and waves into a malevolent force that was specifically targeting them. The final entry on December 15 was short and cryptic. It read simply, "Storm ended," and sea calm followed by the words, "God is over all." This final sentence provided no comfort, but rather a deep sense of finality. If the storm had ended and the sea was calm, why did the men disappear immediately after? And why did James Ducat feel the need to invoke the presence of God in the logbook? The entry was written at 9 in the morning. By nightfall, the light remained unlit and was never seen by passing ships. Somewhere between the morning entry and the coming of dusk on December 15, James Ducat and Thomas Marshall and Donald MacArthur vanished from the face of the earth. Inside the lighthouse, the search party found another clue regarding the equipment of the keepers. In the entrance hall, there was a rack of pegs for the oilskin coats and sea boots the men wore when going outside in rough weather. Joseph Moore noticed that one set of oilskins was still hanging on the peg. This belonged to Donald MacArthur. It was strictly against regulations for a keeper to leave the lighthouse without his protective gear, especially in winter. This suggested that Donald MacArthur had left the tower in a great hurry, perhaps, running out in his shirt sleeves to assist the others or to investigate a sudden emergency. He never returned to retrieve his coat. The prevailing theory that emerged among the search party was that James Ducat and Thomas Marshall had gone down to the West Landing to secure equipment during the storm and had been swept away by a rogue wave. Donald MacArthur, seeing his colleagues in danger, had rushed out to help them and suffered the same fate. However, this theory had significant holes. If the logbook stated that the storm had ended and the sea was calm on December 15, why would a giant wave strike then? And if the storm was raging on the previous days, why would experienced keepers venture into the most dangerous area of the island to secure ropes and crates that were already likely lost? The island of Eilean Mor had a reputation that extended far back before the lighthouse was built. It was named after Saint Flannan, an Irish bishop, who supposedly built a chapel there in the 7th century. For hundreds of years, shepherds from the Isle of Lewis would bring sheep to graze on the island, but they would never spend the night. They believed the island was haunted by spirits and little people who resented human intrusion. It was considered bad luck to speak certain words while on the island, or to forget to perform ritual gestures of respect. The lighthouse keepers were encroaching on a place that had been left to the spirits for centuries. The construction of the lighthouse itself had been a difficult and dangerous undertaking. The workmen had complained of an oppressive atmosphere and a sense of being watched. There were accidents and delays, and the project was plagued by bad weather. When the light was finally lit in 1899, it was seen as a triumph of modern engineering over the dark superstitions of the past. But barely a year later, the island had claimed its first victims. The locals on Lewis nodded grimly when they heard the news. They believed that the 7 hunters had taken their due. The disappearance was not an accident of nature in their eyes, but a retribution from the island itself. As the investigation by Superintendent Robert Muirhead began days later, he struggled to make sense of the physical evidence. Robert Muirhead was the man who had recruited all 3 keepers, and he knew them personally. He respected their professionalism and could not believe they would act recklessly. He examined the west landing, where the damage was most severe. He calculated that a wave capable of moving the stone block would have to be over 100 feet high. Such waves were theoretically possible, but extremely rare. And again, the timing did not match the logbook entries. The disconnect between the recorded calm and the physical destruction was a paradox he could not resolve. Robert Muirhead interviewed the crew of the Hesperus and Joseph more extensively. He asked about the mental state of the men before they went out for their shift. Joseph Mor insisted that they were in good spirits and sound mind. There was no indication of conflict or madness. Yet the logbook entries about crying and praying haunted Robert Muirhead. He could not reconcile the capable men he knew with the terrified figures described in the journal. He wondered if the isolation had caused a collective breakdown, or a form of island madness that distorted their perception of reality. Perhaps the storm they saw was a hallucination born of the solitude. The mystery of the Flannan Isles deepened as rumors began to circulate. Some sailors claimed to have seen a giant sea serpent in the waters around the islands. Others spoke of the phantom of the 7 hunters, a ghostly figure that lured men to their doom. There were whispers that a foreign vessel had kidnapped the men, or that one of them had gone insane and murdered the others before throwing himself into the sea. But there was no blood and no weapon, and the lighthouse was clean. The lack of bodies meant there could be no autopsy and no definitive cause of death. They were simply gone, erased from existence. One particularly chilling detail that Joseph Mor noted was the presence of seabirds. When he first arrived, huge flocks of birds were wheeling around the lighthouse, screaming into the wind. In local folklore, birds were often seen as the receptacles for the souls of drowned sailors. The sheer number of them and their aggressive behavior unsettled the search party. It was as if the island was teeming with a life force that was hostile to the human interlopers. The birds seemed to be guarding the secret of the disappearance, mocking the men who tried to uncover the truth. Superintendent Robert Muirhead eventually concluded his official report on January 8, 1901. He stated that the men had likely been swept away by an unexpected and massive sea surge. While securing the crane and ropes at the west landing, he theorized that they had been caught unaware by a freak wave that rose up the cliffs and dragged them into the boiling ocean. It was a plausible scientific explanation that satisfied the bureaucratic requirements of the Northern Lighthouse Board. It allowed the widows to receive pensions and the case to be officially closed. But privately, Robert Muirhead remained deeply troubled by the inconsistencies he had observed. The official explanation did little to quell the unease of the relief keepers who had to take over the station. Joseph Moore volunteered to stay on the island to keep the light burning along with 3 other volunteers. For weeks, they lived in the shadow of the tragedy, constantly looking over their shoulders. Every creak of the floorboards and every howl of the wind sounded like the returning ghosts of James Duckett and Thomas Marshall. They kept the blinds drawn tight at night, not wanting to see what might be staring in from the dark outside. The psychological strain was immense, and the men spoke little of what they felt. The lighthouse on Eilean Mor continued to operate, but it acquired a dark reputation. Keepers were reluctant to be stationed there, and those who were often requested transfers early. Stories of strange voices carried on the wind and footsteps on the iron gantry became common among the lighthouse servicemen. They said that if you stood on the gallery at night and listened closely, you could hear the names of the 3 missing men being whispered by the sea. The island had marked everyone who set foot on it. It was no longer just a navigation hazard. It was a place where the veil between the living and the dead was dangerously thin. Years later, the poet Wilfred Wilson Gibson wrote a famous poem called Flannan Isle, based on the tragedy. In the poem, he captures the eerie atmosphere of the discovery, describing the untouched meal and the stopped clock. The poem ends with the haunting image of 3 black birds plunging into the night, evoking the souls of the lost keepers. This piece of literature cemented the story in the public imagination, transforming it from a maritime accident into a modern Gothic legend. It highlighted the fragility of human reason when confronted with the vast indifference of the ocean and the inexplicable mysteries of the supernatural. Modern researchers have attempted to use advanced meteorology and oceanography to solve the puzzle. They have simulated wave patterns and atmospheric pressure in the region for December 1900. Some studies suggest that the shape of the seabed around the Flannan Isles can amplify swells, creating giant rogue waves, even in relatively calm weather. This supports Robert Muirhead's theory of a freak wave. Yet science cannot explain the logbook entries. It cannot explain the weeping or the terror or the prayers. It cannot explain why experienced men would be paralyzed by fear of a storm, that their instruments did not register. There remains the possibility that the logbook itself was a fabrication or a sign of shared delusion, shared psychosis, or Foley, adieu, is a rare psychiatric syndrome where delusion is transmitted from one individual to another. In the isolation of the lighthouse, perhaps one man's paranoia infected the others. If James Ducat believed a demonic storm was raging, perhaps Thomas Marshall and Donald MacArthur came to believe it too. In their hallucination, the waves were attacking the tower, and the wind was the voice of God. They may have fled the tower to escape a danger that existed only in their minds, running straight into the real danger of the sea. Another theory that is rarely discussed in official circles involves the infrasound produced by the wind interacting with the geography of the island. Infrasound is a low-frequency sound wave that is below the range of human hearing, but can cause physical and psychological effects. It can induce feelings of dread and anxiety, and even visual hallucinations. The unique shape of the cliffs and the lighthouse tower might have created a sonic resonance that drove the men to the brink of madness. They were being bombarded by a silent noise that triggered a primal fear response, causing them to act irrationally and flee into the ocean, regardless of the cause. The disappearance of the Flannan Isles lighthouse keepers serves as a grim reminder of our vulnerability. We build towers of stone and iron to conquer the dark, but the dark always finds a way in. The lighthouse still stands today, automated now, and empty of human life. The light beams out across the Atlantic warning ships of the dangers of the 7 hunters. But the true danger of Eilean Mor was never just the rocks or the waves. It was the crushing solitude and the unknown forces that dwell in the spaces where humans do not belong. Visitors to the island today describe a heavy atmosphere that clings to the place like a damp fog. The chapel of St. Flannan is a ruin, and the lighthouse is a silent sentinel. The seabirds still wheel and scream overhead, guarding the secrets of the past. When the wind howls through the metal railings of the West Landing, it sounds eerily like a human cry. It is easy to imagine the final moments of James Ducat and Thomas Marshall and Donald MacArthur as they stood on the precipice facing the abyss. Did they see a wave or a monster or the face of God? The story of the Flannan Isles is not just a ghost story, but a psychological horror. It forces us to confront the limits of our understanding. We want answers, and we want logic. We want to know that a led to be and caused C. But on Eilean Mor, the chain of causality is broken. The clues do not add up to a coherent whole. We are left with fragments of a puzzle that will never be solved. The stopped clock, and the cold meal, and the weeping in the logbook are pieces that do not fit into the picture of a simple accident. As night falls over the Hebrides, the light of Eilean Mor begins its rotation. Flash followed by darkness. Flash followed by darkness. It sweeps over the empty ocean, illuminating the white caps of the waves. But for a brief second in the darkness, between the flashes, one might imagine seeing 3 figures standing on the gallery rail, looking out to sea. They are watching for the Hesperus, waiting for a relief that will never come. They are the eternal keepers of the light, bound to the rock by a tragedy that time cannot erase. The mystery of the Flannan Isles persists because it taps into our deepest fears, the fear of isolation, and the fear of the ocean, and the fear of the unknown. It whispers to us that no matter how safe we think we are only one step away from vanishing. It suggests that there are forces in this world that are older and stronger than us, and they do not care about our rules or our logic. The keepers did their duty until the very end, and then they were taken, and all that remains is the silence. In the end, the sea keeps its secrets. The bodies of James Duckett and Thomas Marshall and Donald MacArthur were never recovered. They were claimed by the Atlantic and became part of the mythology of the 7 hunters. The logbook sits in a museum, archive its pages yellowed with age, preserving the final terrified thoughts of the men. And out in the darkness, on the edge of the world, the lighthouse stands alone. It is a monument to human endeavor, and a tombstone for 3 men who stared into the void and blinked.